Our speaker tonight is Zak Podmore, who's an award-winning author and journalist and has spent more than a decade writing about water conservation issues in the western United States. He's the author of Confluence, Navigating Personal and Political on the Rivers of the New West, and his work has appeared in Outside, USA Today, National Geographic Traveler, and elsewhere. He currently resides in Bluff, Utah. And I ask that you please silence your devices and hold all questions till the end. We'll have a brief Q&A session when Zak is done with his talk. With that, I'm excited to introduce tonight's speaker, Zak Podmore. Thank you.
See if this mic works. This is fancy. I don't have to hold it up. You know, you guys know how to do things right up here in Aspen. And you even know how to fill a room here for me to make me not feel self-conscious with only the front row filled here. That's always a little awkward, and there's 100 empty chairs. So I'm very grateful to all of you for coming out, making the trek down that path to get here. I almost fell in a puddle, so I hope everyone fared better. I thought that we were in a drought out here, but it seems, you know, there was enough mud to make it feel otherwise. And thanks so much for ACES for hosting me tonight and Wilderness Workshop. I was in Carbondale last night as part of the same series. So I'm grateful to be back in the Roaring Fork Valley where I grew up. I grew up in Glenwood. So it's nice to reconnect with some old friends and everything over the last couple days. So thanks to you for making that possible. Let me get into the right slideshow here. All right, we got it. So yeah, this book came out a little over a year ago, and it was looking at what's happening in Lake Powell since it was last full in 1999. That's when, you know, I'm sure a lot of people remember in this room, 2002, when everything really crashed, when one of the driest years on record. Lake Powell went way down. This winter, we're pretty close to being back at 2002 levels. So in the Colorado River Basin as a whole, I don't know exactly right in this zone, but definitely dry up there. And that, you know, has a lot of concerns attached to it of running out of water. We don't want to do that. You guys are all smart for living up close to the headwaters where you don't have to worry about it going through a bunch of reservoirs and canal systems to get to a place like Phoenix or Tucson. So very good choice of location. Even if there's less snow, you still have puddles. But even with this drought that we're experiencing, it's not all bad news for the environment on the Colorado River, because Glen Canyon, this national park quality landscape that was drowned in the 1960s and 70s and 80s under Lake Powell, is coming back to life in a really amazing and rapid manner, and we'll get into that too tonight. So that's the story that revolves around a piece of concrete that plugs the Colorado River right by the Utah-Arizona border by Page, Arizona. But Lake Powell was not the first reservoir that was ever built in Glen Canyon in this area. Around 900 years ago, a group of ancestral farmers created this much smaller reservoir. It was a tank that captured water from a spring that was coming out of the cliffs and was capable of holding around 10,000 gallons worth of water. The walls were 5 feet thick, sealed with mortar, watertight, and there was just one little opening down at the bottom there. So it was a pretty sophisticated little water catchment, and it was excavated in the early 1960s when Glen Canyon Dam was under construction and later was flooded by Lake Powell. So presumably when this tank was full, slowly filled up by the springs that were coming out of the cliffs and just kind of seeping into the ground, a diver would plunge down to the bottom of the pool and pull a plug in that little hole that was at the bottom, and water would flow out through a canal system that went about a half mile down slope and had head gates on it. It branched into an irrigation system that was capable of watering several acres of crops. And they found these rock-lined canals that went down the slope. So I start the book by talking about this ancient reservoir in Glen Canyon. One, to acknowledge that people have been living and farming in Glen Canyon for many thousands of years, but also to talk about a way in which that ancient reservoir was better designed in one specific way than the Glen Canyon Dam itself. So I'll just read a little paragraph from that about that. Like the indigenous farmer's ancient stone tank, the Glen Canyon Dam is an impressive feat of engineering. Around 300 feet thick at its base, and with a curving 25-foot thick crest that extends for nearly a third of a mile, the Glen Canyon Dam was, at the time of its construction, one of the highest concrete arch dams in the world, and it is large enough to tower over the Great Pyramid of Giza. Before it started to silt in, Lake Powell boasted a storage capacity of 27 million acre-feet, capable of holding back over 2 years' worth of the Colorado River's average annual flow. The 186-mile-long reservoir oozes across maps of southern Utah like a Rorschach-ian ink stain, filling over 100 side canyons to form a houseboat paradise that draws millions of annual visitors. The dam's hydroelectric plant can generate 7,000 gigawatt hours each year, at least back in the 90s when it was functioning at full capacity. It's much lower now, which back then was enough power to light nearly 600,000 homes. But had the builders of the much smaller reservoir on the Riverside Dune in the 12th century witnessed the flooding of their handiwork by Lake Powell far in the future, they likely would have noticed that the Glen Canyon Dam had a serious design flaw. The Bureau of Reclamation's best minds forgot to install something that the builders of the spring-fed tank had considered key: a drain at the bottom. So as the Glen Canyon Dam was being constructed, there were two giant tunnels that were drilled through the sandstone cliffs that diverted the entire flow of the river into the sandstone and back out on the other side. So there was a dry place to pour the concrete. But as the dam was nearing completion, both of those tunnels were filled with reinforced concrete. And so right now there are only 3 ways to release water through the Glen Canyon Dam and into the Grand Canyon, which begins just downstream. There's the spillways at the very top, which are only used when Lake Powell is close to full. If anyone's read the great book, The Emerald Mile, about 1983, when Lake Powell had too much water in it, and the opposite problem that we're seeing now, and the Glen Canyon Dam almost collapsed because of the damage that was being caused in the spillways. It's a great book if you haven't read it. Kevin Fedarko. They had to put plywood at the top of the spillways to buy themselves a little extra time to overfill the reservoir as they tried to figure out what was happening. But those spillways have only been used a handful of times in the history of the Glen Canyon Dam. The main way water is released into the Grand Canyon is through those middle set of tunnels, the hydropower penstocks that spin the turbines and generate the electricity. And we could reach the level of those penstocks by, before 2027, by December of this year. That's how low Lake Powell is. But as you can see, those outlets are still more than halfway up the back of the dam. And there's these other set of tunnels at what's typically known as the dead pool level, a little further down, but still hundreds of feet above the historic river elevation. And because they're not designed for continuous use, the Bureau of Reclamation, which manages the dam, has said it's not safe to let the level of Lake Powell drop below that minimum power pool level, because you start to risk losing the dam, like started to happen in 1983, just because those tunnels could start to erode and cavitate, and bad things could happen. So we are one year away, potentially, unless we start to get a bunch of snow in the next month, from reaching a point where Lake Powell still stretches over 100 miles upstream into Glen Canyon. There's millions of acre feet of water trapped in Lake Powell, but there's no way to get that water out and downstream if it's needed. It becomes what's known as the dead storage. So it's just evaporation pit At that point, hydropower could stop. All the boat ramps, um, all the boat ramps in their current design would all be sitting on top of cliffs, and so you couldn't get a boat in to even houseboat down there, or just take your jet boat, fishing boat out. And those storage, that benefits that are provided by the dam wouldn't really be there at all either, because you're not able to release the water when you need it. It's just the water's trapped because of the design of the dam. So there are three kind of major ways to think about what Lake Powell is and what it does. The first is as part of a plumbing system that provides water to 40 million people, including all of you, across 7 states and 2 countries and 30 Native American nations. That black line on the map is the political boundary that was drawn under the Colorado River Compact in 1922 that separated the upper and lower Colorado River basins. So you've seen stuff in the news about the current negotiations going on over the Colorado River that have been dragging on for years. It's pretty much the upper basin, Colorado, Utah, New Mexico, and Wyoming, versus the lower basin, Nevada, California, and Arizona. And both of those groups of states are trying to decide who's going to have to take more water reductions when we start to have to take major water reductions, partly because of the design of the Glen Canyon Dam. The Glen Canyon Dam, as you can see, was built just upstream from that black boundary, and it was designed in part to capture water that would, otherwise go to California and get out of the upper basin. So it was designed to hold back the upper basin's water and not give the lower basin more than their share. Um, but that's all it really does. When it was designed to produce hydropower and to store water. There's no diversions that come out of Lake Powell. There's no irrigation that goes to farms from Lake Powell. There's only a tiny municipal diversion to the town of Page, which is about 6,000 people, but it's the second largest reservoir in the country. So all it does is kind of hold water, produce power, but all of those benefits are very much under threat right now. But of course, the way that most people know and enjoy Lake Powell is as the greatest place to houseboat in the world. Um, I spent a lot of time writing this book. I was kayaking along for many trips across Lake Powell, going for days on end. Sunburned, windburned, uh, exhausted, paddling into the wind, and I'd see one of these houseboats come by. People under the shade on the roof, grilling hot dogs, drinking cold beverages, opening the fridge, and I'd try to wave them down, but they never stopped for me. Until last October, I finally got to set foot on a houseboat for the first time. I didn't get to sleep on there. I had to sleep on the little tent on the end of that peninsula because there wasn't room. But I got to experience the high life. It's very nice. I get why people love spending so much time on Lake Powell. It's massive when it's full. The shoreline is longer than the coast of California. There's just all these pockets and beaches and places to hang out, and millions of people go there to enjoy it in that fashion every year. But there's another way that Glen Canyon sometimes gets discussed, or Lake Powell, and that's as an environmental travesty, a place that would almost certainly be a national park today had it not been flooded by Lake Powell. And people who saw Glen Canyon before the dam was built, like the great folk singer Katie Lee and Edward Abbey here, spent the rest of their lives trying to fight for a future where the Glen Canyon Dam would look something like that, and Glen Canyon would start to reemerge from under Lake Powell. They were so taken by this landscape because it was a very unique canyon of the Colorado, 186 miles of these winding, peaceful curves. Some rapids drowned in Lower Cataract, but most of Glen Canyon itself was only had a few riffles in it, a good family float. There were all these beaches and many side hikes that offered kind of endless opportunities for exploration. to arches and pools and waterfalls and thousands of cultural sites. Most of the tributaries that flow into Glen Canyon have perennial streams in them that support green groves and glens of cottonwoods. That's where the name comes from. And so even in a really dry part of the country in southern Utah, there's all these oases there were in these tributary canyons that fed into Glen Canyon. So when I was growing up down in Glenwood, both my parents were school teachers down there, and they enjoyed, not working in the summer and going rafting instead. So they took my sister and I out on a lot of raft trips. I'm sure a lot of people in this room have done river trips in Utah, and you probably sat around the campfire and talked about the river trip you might never get to do, which is Glen Canyon, because it flooded under Lake Powell. So that's kind of the perspective I was exposed to growing up. That was still the way I thought about Lake Powell in 2011 when my friend and I had just graduated from college. We didn't have any job prospects or anything, going for us in life. So we said, let's go on the longest kayak trip possible. So we went to the source of the Green River in the Wind River Mountains in Wyoming in October and started following the little creek that flowed out of this lake at the source of the Green River. Followed it for a couple weeks until we had enough water to float a kayak, and eventually made it down to Lake Powell about a month and a half after we started. So about 900 miles into the trip. And we'd over the course of that month and a half or so, we'd gotten into a pretty bad habit of always being behind schedule. We had to make a certain number of miles every day to meet our Grand Canyon permit for the end of November. And we'd always have to paddle for, half an hour in the dark in order to stay on track. And that wasn't too big of a deal most of the way. In the moonlight, we'd be able to see a beach to pull over on, and we'd set up our tents and fall asleep. But when we came through Cataract Canyon and crossed over onto Lake Powell, which was much higher back in 2011 than it is now, we found ourselves in a canal of sediment. Lake Powell, sediment that's been trapped in Lake Powell since 1963. The lake had just come up that year. It was a good snow year. And the lake was lapping the sides of these sheer walls of mud that were going down into the river. And it got dark on us. We couldn't find a campsite. We couldn't even find a place to physically get out of our boats and get, even make a bad campsite, let alone a good one. So we were paddling along in the dark. It was freezing cold. There was ice on our kayaks. We were both blaming the other one for not stopping at the nice campsite we passed while it was still light out and trying to figure out what to do. And we eventually found a place where there was like a crack in the mud and we could kind of scramble up through it. And I remember I stepped out of my kayak and to try and get to shore, and I just sunk in muck up to my knees. It smelled horrible, decomposing tamarisk and stuff. And I tried to get out of it. My shoe got ripped off. So then I had to reach down in there, and it was probably 25 degrees out. So I was shivering, all wet now, covered in mud. And I thought every bad thing I've ever heard about Lake Powell was absolutely true. Is at the worst place in the world, and I never want to go here again. So we spent the next 7 days paddling across it to the Grand Canyon as quickly as possible. We didn't get out. We didn't explore. We just, got in our kayaks into the wind and paddled and camped and kept going. We went through the Grand Canyon and across Lake Mead and through all the little reservoirs on the Arizona-California border until the last remnants of the Colorado River were diverted into a canal. The Colorado River dries up right on the border with Mexico. All that remaining water, which isn't much at that point, goes into a canal system that we floated down in our pack rafts for 5 days until the canals dried up as well. This is the end of the line. And then we, from there, packed up our pack rafts and bushwhacked until we made it to the Gulf of California, looking a little bit, hairier than when we had started out 4 months earlier. And when I've, thought back on that trip, there were so many places I wanted to go explore that we had passed and didn't get to spend much time in. Lake Powell, pretty much the bottom of the list. This is what I thought about when I thought of Lake Powell. It was mud and trash. Sometimes the shoreline isn't as nice in places. Plus, I was biased. But that changed 10 years after that trip. I was working as a reporter for the Salt Lake Tribune, and I got to do a trip for a week with 25 scientists with the Returning Rapids Project in Moab, which are studying what low water is doing to Lake Powell and how the ecology is coming back. So I got to spend a week around the campfire and helping these researchers with their science, hearing just their excitement in their voices around all the places that were being re-exposed by what it was then a record low level on Lake Powell. There were people studying how the sediment was moving, how what was the endangered fish were inhabiting new corridors of river that used to be reservoir. There's over 100 new miles of river that have reemerged on the San Juan and Colorado rivers compared to 1999 when Lake Powell was last full. And I started to think maybe I need to re-examine my position on Lake Powell because they all seemed to think it was pretty cool. So I spent the next couple years going out on trips with a lot of people who were on that trip, and just learning more about the research that was being done there that became the basis for the book. So we'll talk about a few aspects of that tonight. And since I'm, a writer, very creative, very original, I came up with this idea for explaining it called The Bad, the Ugly, and the Good. I very original, but the bad in this case is climate change. And it's a big piece of why we've gotten where we are on the Colorado River. The Colorado River has gotten a lot, or the Southwest in general, it's gotten a lot hotter and a lot drier over the last 25 years compared to the previous century. That map on the left is the change in precipitation patterns. You can see the big brown splotch that indicates drier weather is right on top of the Colorado River Basin. And then the temperature map, the big red splotch is right on top of the Colorado River Basin as well. That's it's still the case today, of course. This is the map of the states that had the record-breaking warmest December on record, just the month before last. And those red states are the ones that had the warmest December ever, and every single Colorado River Basin state was on there. That's led to some of the lowest snowpacks ever. The Utah's having its driest year on record, and the Colorado River is pretty close to where it was in 2002, which is the driest year. There's just only got a couple more graphs and stuff, but this is showing the general decline in flows in the Colorado River Basin. So that big blue bump on the left is the high water years in the 1980s when the Glen Canyon Dam almost broke from having too much water in it. Then there were the pretty good years in the 90s that refilled Lake Powell and Lake Mead for the last time. And then you can see the peaks have gotten lower since then and the troughs deeper. And meanwhile, that red line shows the total use throughout the Colorado River Basin. So flows have declined by around 20% compared to the previous century since the year 2000, but we use pretty much the same amount of water as we used to. There's been some efforts to make cuts in the last couple years, but not nearly on the scale to start to balance the water budget and only use as much water as currently exists. But we've gotten away with using more water than actually flows into the river for 25 years now because we had the two largest reservoirs in the country, Lake Powell and Lake Mead, at near capacity in 1999. And we've drained them almost to the limit of what the dams can handle based on their current design. Last graph here, this is the latest projections from the Bureau of Reclamation itself, showing the water levels on Lake Powell. So in recent years, that red line has been the most accurate prediction line. It's the minimum probable flows, but it's even been lower than that in recent years. So if we have a red line scenario for the spring runoff this year, Lake Powell won't even come up when all the snow starts to melt. There's not enough snow. So you can see that it just keeps going down. And we cross that line of minimum power pool in December. This is pretty much the exact same trend that was happening as I was writing the book. It was Lake Powell was slightly lower in the spring of 2023 than it is right now. That was the all-time record low. And then we had that great runoff in 2023 that brought Lake Powell up a little bit, but now we're heading back down through this same cycle. Has been occurring out by Lone Rock is just one way to visualize the dropping water levels. Now we come to the ugly, the Dominy Formation. This is a geologic layer unofficially named by geologists who are studying sediment in Glen Canyon for all the mud that's been trapped in Glen Canyon since 1963. It is, of course, a reference to the great Floyd Dominy, the commissioner of the Bureau of Reclamation in the 1960s when the Glen Canyon Dam was being completed. If you read like Encounters with the Archdruid, a really good book about the debate between David Brower of the Sierra Club and Floyd Dominy. He's a really good character, and now he has a geologic layer named after him. And if you've floated through, how many people have floated through Cataract Canyon before? Quite a few. Nice. So you remember going through the big drops here, big drop 3, the last rapid in Cataract until recently when a few new rapids started to emerge from under Lake Powell. You're in this really muddy water and you cross over the high water mark of Lake Powell and you get into the areas that were trapping sediment back in the 80s and 90s. And there's just these massive layers of Dominy Formation, 160, 180 feet, 200 feet tall, that really dominate the landscape through Lower Cataract Canyon. There's been a lot of erosion since 2011 when we couldn't even find a place to get out on shore. So there are nice campsites in there now, but it's still a lot of mud. In the book, I talk about, one way to visualize how much mud gets trapped in Lake Powell every year is an acre of land, area slightly smaller than a football field with 38,000 feet of sediment piled up on that acre. So taller than Mount Everest. That's how much mud gets trapped in Lake Powell every single year since 1963. But that mud is not evenly distributed throughout Glen Canyon. It's mostly trapped in the upper reaches of the reservoir. So I thought when I started this project, if Lake Powell were to disappear tomorrow, you'd see something like this throughout all of the heart of Glen Canyon that was so famous from the 1950s when people started to raft it. But that's really not the case. There's very little mud in the heart of Glen Canyon itself still, and a lot of it is trapped in places where you can see it now. And you can understand why that's the case if you take a trip down the Colorado or San Juan rivers. This one is on the San Juan, below the usual takeout at Clay Hills Crossing. You portage around a waterfall that's made in the Dominy Formation, and you continue through a section of river that looks a little more natural than the cataract section. It's wider and the Dominy Formation's more spread out, so it doesn't have those giant 200-foot tall banks. There are giant cottonwood trees that are growing back. This area was last underwater in 2011, so all this vegetation has grown back since then. There's beavers, tons of beavers in the banks, willows growing underneath the cottonwood trees, peregrine falcons, river otters, a ton of endangered fish, razorback suckers. And it feels like a really healthy area, even though it's only been a river for 15 years or so. You go a little further to areas that got exposed more recently, and the water gets muddier. This is my friend Wade, who's actually down in this very spot right now. I talk about him in the book, and he's famous for being a poor packer. So he had his entire kayak packed full of stuff, and then he had this massive bag strapped onto the back of his kayak, which is not recommended usually, even when you're going through little rapids here. And he couldn't even close it. It was so full. So I have a whole description in the book of everything he had in there. He had a full-size Dutch oven. He had a fire blanket and a blowtorch. So every morning he'd get out his fire blanket to catch the ashes and build a fire on the fire blanket, and then light it with his blowtorch, and then put his Dutch oven on it, and then he'd pull it. He had like 30 rolls of Pillsbury biscuits and cinnamon rolls, those like tubes. So he'd pop one of those open and bake some fresh baked goods in the morning, which wasn't, it was nice, but I was glad he made it through without capsizing. I think he also had a ukulele in there and some other things. So I followed Wade through the Great Bend of the San Juan, where the mud gets more and more raw and exposed. There's all these weird mud bergs that break off from the sides. There's slumps that are happening all the time. Rapids can form and disappear in a matter of minutes or hours as the mud shifts around and sand waves form. You never really know what you're going to see. It's pretty bizarre if you get out and walk around. You have to be careful where you step, or you might have a bad morning like Wade did. And it's, a beautiful landscape too, but one that's very dominated by the sediment in areas where vegetation hasn't had a chance to reestablish yet. And just before you cross over the reservoir delta, where the river meets Lake Powell, it gets really shallow. There's usually a bunch of pelicans hanging out right there, and you can see the current start to slow down. And even before the current stops flowing, you can see it start to get more and more clear. You can see the sediment settling out to the bottom of the reservoir. And then a few miles past that, it's the Lake Powell we all love, the blue waters, and pretty much all of that sediment has gone down to the bottom of the reservoir. So those massive walls of sediment are underwater, just right at the interface between the river and the reservoir, but they're not throughout all of Glen Canyon towards the dam yet. This kind of shows how that process works. The dam was built in 1963. The reservoir started to fill. A little bit of sediment, maybe 10 or 20 feet, went down to the bottom of Glen Canyon. But when Lake Powell was full in the 80s and 90s, the vast majority of the sediment got trapped in the upstream reaches of the reservoir. And since then, it's pushed further into the canyon. This is a 12-mile section of river below height, Utah, between 2019 and 2022. And you can see these 12 miles filling in the sediment in that time span. So there's basically a glacier of mud that's moving, 200 feet tall, moving down the Colorado River and leaving, mud in the side canyons, giant walls of mud eventually in the river corridor itself. And it's going to lead to a very different recovery for Glen Canyon the further it gets. If you have 20 feet of sediment, mostly sand down further, it washes out pretty quickly. If you have 200 feet of sticky silt, it takes much longer to recover. So if Lake Powell were to disappear tomorrow, there would be pretty quick recovery for over 120 miles of the Colorado River corridor. And if we were to wait 50 years to deal with the issue at Lake Powell, these mud glaciers would get much closer to the dam. So there's a good part of this story as well, which I promised you at the beginning, which is called the Rebirth of Glen Canyon. There's over 100,000 acres of land that were once flooded by Lake Powell that have been re-exposed, and some of that area has been exposed continuously since 2000 at this point. So we have a pretty good idea of what things look like when you give them a chance to recover. And you can see that firsthand if you walk up pretty much any of the side canyons that feed into Glen Canyon below where the Mud Glacier reservoir deltas currently are. You start out by paddling through forests of cottonwood trees that drowned in the 60s and 70s. They still have their bark on them. They haven't decomposed very much. You can see, someone tied a life jacket to the top of that one on the right there to when it was just under the surface of the water to mark it as an obstacle for boaters. You pull your boat over on a muddy bank at the end of the reservoir and start walking upstream. You start out by going through areas that have only been exposed for a few weeks or a few months if the reservoir is dropping. There might be a little bit of tumbleweed growing back, some invasive species. You pass all sorts of interesting trash out there. And I've, been recommending this to people I've been talking to. There's a whole, PhD waiting to happen for an archaeologist who wants to study these cans. There, you can often see, a Budweiser collection from the 1970s that was right under where somebody stopped to fish for a few hours. And I'm sure you could date that very precisely. Somebody even opened this can at the bottom for a quick shotgun of the beer. And then you walk around the corner of the canyon and you see this, and you have to wonder, some archaeologist has to figure out whether those two events were related or which can belongs to this boat. You get a little higher in elevation to areas that have had a few years to recover. You start to see more native species. You see cattails coming back. You see wildlife moving back in. You see places where beavers have swam across the lake and even into box canyons and started to re-inhabit some of the side canyons that were used to be under Lake Powell. There are beaver dams everywhere. They're holding back these little streams, making giant pools that are full of fish, supporting giant cottonwood trees and willow stands. You can see above the height of that trees, there's that white line on the rock. That's the bathtub ring of where Lake Powell was when it was full. So all of this has come back since Lake Powell started to drop. This is Seth Ahrens, an ecologist who is doing the only plant survey of these areas that used to be flooded. It's a really basic survey, just looking at the density and diversity of different plants in about 30 side canyons. He's been at it for 5 years now, and just trying to get a sense for the trends of what's happening in these side canyons as they recover. And he's found in canyon after canyon that after 12 or 15 years, the native species are outcompeting the invasive species, and the ecosystem itself, from the diversity of plants, is just as healthy as areas that never flooded. So all it needs is 15 years, and these habitats, ecosystems come back and are just as healthy as if they had never been drowned under Lake Powell for 50 years. So it's an much quicker pace than anyone expected to see, especially in areas that have a flowing stream through them. And you could expect to see that, if canyons get uncovered for 15 years continuously that are still underwater at this point. The sediment is also clearing out much more rapidly in the side canyons. There are places that were completely filled with sand when they first reemerged from Lake Powell, like this slot canyon here. There were, people looking to try and find out where this slot canyon was when in 2005, when it was first came out of Lake Powell, and they couldn't find it, and they realized they were walking on top of the slot canyon. It was completely full of sand, and just a few flash floods cleared it out and revealed this amazing subway. There's places that you'd never know were underwater for 50 years. Sometimes somebody leaves you a little message on the wall. This picture was taken in 2022. You can see that muddy line up there with the 2020 on top of it. That's about where the sediment was in 2020. So just 2 years, and that's how much sediment cleared out of this side canyon. A lot of places, as you get higher, all that Dominy Formation has been washed away, and you're walking on bedrock again. You go higher, and the trees get bigger. It could be kind of hard to see where the high water mark is, but one thing you can look for is the lichen line. The lichen is the last thing to come back. So sometimes the cottonwoods are so big you don't know exactly where Lake Powell was when it was full, but you can still see a distinct line of lichen in some places. And then you get above the high water mark into areas that never flooded. In other canyons, there are cultural resources reemerging, ancestral Puebloan steps, rock imagery that's very impacted by being under Lake Powell, but there's still petroglyphs and pottery. Archaeologists have found full pots and full baskets that were underwater for decades and didn't decompose and are now washing out in the back of houseboat campsites. So there's a lot of very important artifacts that weren't destroyed by Lake Powell. There's historic inscriptions. This one's from the 1890s. In places that used to see a lot of visitation when you could houseboat right up to them, like Defiance House here, you used to be able to pull your boats up just below it and sit on the roof of the kiva and hang out, are now miles from the lake. So the impacts are just dramatically different. It's a nightmare for. I talked to a lot of ex-archaeologists for Glen Canyon National Recreation Area, and it's just impossible to manage because if there's damage occurring in another area, you can kind of rope things off or close areas or stabilize ruins. But if the lake is changing by feet every few weeks, and that's creating entirely different places where people are camping or hanging out or hiking, and there's artifacts that you don't even know are there because they've been under Dominy Formation and are now washing out, it's really difficult to figure out how to protect those resources. There's arches that you used to be able to jet ski through that you now have to hike to. Natural bridges that have reemerged. And even the bathtub ring, which is kind of the first thing a lot of people think about when they think about low water on Lake Powell, it's starting to disappear and heal in places as well. So I get into a lot more in the book. I have a whole chapter on the history of the Bureau of Reclamation in its heyday in the 1930s with the construction of the Hoover Dam and the Grand Coulee Dam a little later, and the economic model that was used to construct these giant projects. And I have spent a few days with an economist from the University of Utah, Marshall Steinbaum, here to help me out with that chapter. And Marshall talked about, the ways in which if we ever got a federal government that wanted to do good things again, we could and wanted to use the model that was used in the New Deal for producing building these giant dam projects. The Hoover Dam was the largest dam on the planet and the largest power plant on the planet when it was first built. That record was broken by subsequent dams in the 30s. We could do great things in the battle against climate change. So there's kind of a thought experiment of if Lake Powell were to go away, there's all these side canyons that are coming back really rapidly, really ecologically important. But there's all these giant bays that are down by Page, Arizona. It used to be shallow bays that are going to take much longer to heal because they don't have flowing streams in them. And they're located right next to power lines. So the Bureau of Reclamation, if it wanted to get back in the power plant construction game, could put some solar over these areas that are all full of tires and lawn chairs and stuff, located next to giant transmission lines that are about to be obsolete from the Glen Canyon Dam, and replace the power from the Glen Canyon Dam. There's also a chapter on the history of the Navajo Nation, and its relationship with the Glen Canyon National Recreation Area and Lake Powell. And the movement that's underway on the Navajo Nation to change the boundary of the reservation back to where it was in the 1950s, before hundreds of thousands of acres were uh, taken from the Navajo Nation with no compensation, because they were flooded by Lake Powell and became National Park Service land. But I won't get into too deep into all of that. I can start to wrap up here. But we have a reservoir that is on the brink of failure. We have way too much storage in the Colorado River basin. Just way too much reservoir capacity for the amount of snow we've been getting. If you were to take water from every single reservoir in the entire Colorado River basin, from Rudai, and the reservoirs, Blue Mesa on the Gunnison, and Flaming Gorge on the Green River, and Navajo on the San Juan River, and Lake Powell, and all the reservoirs that are below the Hoover Dam. There's like, I don't know, 18, I think, pretty big, substantial dams in the Colorado River system. Remove water from every single reservoir into Lake Mead today, Lake Mead wouldn't be full. That's how much overcapacity we have. And some of those reservoirs are more important for certain areas because they provide irrigation water or something. Lake Powell doesn't, provide any benefits when it gets this low, because recreation becomes more difficult when the boat ramps start to dry out. Hydropower could be lost, and the storage benefits aren't there at all when you're near dead pool. So for a long time, there were, when the dam was working as intended and creating this amazing place to go do your reservoir recreation, there was kind of an alliance between the water managers, who just want to move water downstream and get it to everyone who needs it and all the farms that need it, and the houseboat community that got to enjoy the benefits of water storage in an incredibly beautiful canyon. And they both got to laugh at people like poor Katie Lee, who would go around. And she came to Carbondale when I was in high school there, I remember, and she'd play her guitar and sing her folk songs about how we've got to drain Lake Powell and restore Glen Canyon. And, from the water manager's perspective and the houseboater's perspective, why would you do that if it's working as you thought it was going to work? But now we're in a very different place, because the water managers, especially in the lower basin in California and Arizona, are starting to see the Glen Canyon Dam and its design as a major threat to water delivery. The 3 lower basin states have all written letters to the Bureau of Reclamation asking for them to start thinking about modifying the Glen Canyon Dam, potentially with tunnels at river level around the dam that would allow Lake Powell to be completely emptied if we need that water in an extreme drought situation. And you could see a scenario start to develop where water managers who might not care too much about Glen Canyon, might not care about the beavers, the cottonwood trees as much as Katie Lee did, would start to have some overlapping interests, because the Glen Canyon Dam is preventing water deliveries from operating smoothly. And things, even if it's as dry as it is now, would be a little bit easier to deal with if you just had to worry about dead pool on Lake Mead at the Hoover Dam, and not dead pool on 2 massive reservoirs that are almost empty. And the benefit to that, change in perspective on water management of the value of the Glen Canyon Dam, would be the continued recovery of Glen Canyon itself, which would be, in the middle of the climate crisis, in the middle of our water crisis, it would be something to celebrate, to be able to watch this landscape, come back to life, and a national park reemerge from under the waters of Lake Powell. I'll just leave you with a couple photos of the cathedral in the desert, this amazing chamber in the rock that was underwater for 50 some years, until it reemerged recently. And it's just an amazing place to hang out, watch the water pour down this waterfall into a pool, and think about the mistakes we might have made in our past, but also our opportunities for doing things better in the future. So thank you all so much for coming out. Thank you for listening. And I appreciate it. Thanks again to ACES.
Zach, that was great. We're going to open up the floor for a couple of questions. If anybody has one, I'll bring the phone that's kind of working over you. Are you selling books tonight?
I've got books out there on the table. Thank you very much. I got my helper here. So just pass the tea. I'll be out there selling books if you want to pick one up. Yeah.
So you can be forgiven for not really getting into politics, but what about our obligations under the compact to deliver 7.5 million acre feet to the lower basin states every year?
Yeah.
What if California puts a bill in Congress to say you have to empty Lake Dillon, Twin Lakes, Root Eye, and send us that water, and Denver is out of water? What about that?
I mean, I think it's a little hard to. I mean, the Colorado River Compact is more or less. You can decipher it because it talks about 7.5 million acre feet for both basins. But ever since the compact was signed in 1922, there's 1,000 layers of other agreements and laws and plans and handshake deals, but also Supreme Court cases that go on top of that, and also the negotiations that are happening now. It gets very, very complicated. But yeah, it is possible there could be a compact call where the lower basin demands more water from the upper basin. And if Lake Powell is that dead pool by the end of this year, if we can't get any more water out without endangering the dam, then how do you, it's not helping you with that compact call, right? You have enough water to meet that demand. It's trapped there in the upper basin, but there's no easy way to get it out and downstream because there's, I think, at the level where they're going to cap it at, there's over 5.5 million acre feet of water that's just sitting there in Lake Powell evaporating. So I don't know, maybe I'm naive, but I think the upper basin, Colorado is kind of the leader of the upper basin, could theoretically get some concessions out of the lower basin. Nobody wants to take cuts to their current water use, and that's what the debate is about right now. But if you said, we're willing to not fully decommission the Glen Canyon Dam ever and get rid of it for good, but we're willing to drill lower tunnels to be able to access that water, that's going to be a benefit to California. Maybe we can make some deal to not have a compact call or to get some assurances that things will work out better. But I don't know if that's actually happening. That's what I would do. But yeah, it's a good question. It could get weird with the politics. I think Arizona just set aside millions of dollars for their legal defense fund for water stuff, and it could get ugly here soon.
Well, that was Arizona.
Yeah.
Is there a danger of Lake Mead reaching Deadpool as well? And
Oh, yeah.
is there a plug in that? And are there these same research around all of that?
Yeah, it's more concerning there even because it does provide water to Las Vegas, and then it's so important to. There's 27 million people that get water downstream from the Glen Canyon Dam. So basically, if you hit what we're calling dead pool on Lake Powell, where they're not going to let it go below that, and all that water's trapped, you have to just throttle back the releases to match whatever's flowing in from the Colorado River, like through Cataract Canyon and through the San Juan River. So whatever the natural flow is upstream is what the releases would be downstream, because you can't let the reservoir drop anymore. So that could mean the lowest releases through the Grand Canyon that we've seen since the dam was built, and then that would start to send Lake Mead, which is also pretty much in the same situation Lake Powell is at, down towards Deadpool even more quickly. It has it's better designed dam. The penstocks are vertical instead of horizontal, so they can release water at different levels, but there's still a dead pool on the Hoover Dam as well, and it would be not the end of the world, I guess, if it hit dead pool on Lake Powell, if it wasn't for all the water infrastructure that would be impacted downstream. So that's a big part of the puzzle.
Mhm. So you're talking about drilling around the dam for release. Are they talking about using like more modern turbine technology, low head hydro, in that to actually generate some electricity there as well?
Yeah, there's they haven't fully released. They did a study in 2022, the Bureau of Reclamation, on ways to continue producing power with dam modifications at lower levels. And they didn't fully release that as far as I know. There's like kind of an overview. Um, but yeah, I think you'd produce a lot less power if you were, had a much lower reservoir because you wouldn't get the benefits of that drop. So yeah, there's ways to do it, but there's already the Glen Canyon Dam is producing record low amounts of power. Even when it was functioning at full capacity in the 80s, it produced almost not quite half as much power, or a little more than half as much power as the Navajo Generating Station, the giant coal plant that was located right next to the Glen Canyon Dam. That was producing way more power than the Glen Canyon Dam was, even at its full functioning, and that shut down in 2019. It didn't. They're not as critical to the grid as they once were, right? Because Glen Canyon Dam is it produces some federal revenue. The power is sold by the federal government, and that paid off the dam over the last 60 years. But it's really not a key part of the grid like it used to be when it was the biggest power plant around.
So you talk a lot about the bathtub ring. Some of us find that like the most unaesthetic part of the drying of Lake Powell. But I was pretty pleased that you were saying that in places it was looked like it was self cleaning or self healing. How is that? You got hundreds of miles of that around there. What kind of percentage would you say is cleaning itself, and how long is it going to take until it looks like a natural walls again?
Yeah, um, it's a good question. I mean, it really depends on the geology. If there's, sometimes there's the like Wingate sandstone with shale on the top, and that shale washes off and covers up the bathtub ring. If it's just like a sheer Navajo sandstone cliff with slick rock on the top, it heals more slowly because it doesn't have like iron washing over the top of it. If it's a narrow slot canyon where it gets a lot of shade, it seems to have disappeared completely in places. So it depends on where you are. I mean, it's going to be thousands of years before you wouldn't have any idea that Lake Powell was ever there. But from an ecological perspective, the recovery is really quick, and the bathtub ring, doesn't have any negative impacts for the ecology. So, but yeah, it'll become less apparent over the years.
All right, final question over here.
All right.
Zach, can you give us an update on the status of the takeout at height at the bottom of Cataract Canyon? Do you have to motor out to the Bullfrog when you run cat now?
Yeah, so the takeout for Cataract is in the Dominy Formation. It completely slumped off. The boat ramp just slumped off a few years ago. Became really hard to get a boat out of there. There's only one commercial company that is still using it, and they have to build like a PVC scaffolding every time they take out, and then pull the boats up with winches and trucks and stuff. It's really hard to use. They just got funding to fix it, I've heard. I don't know. There's two plans that I heard, and I don't know which one they're going with. Either like a easier fix in the Dominy Formation or full boat ramp construction across the river. But they say I just heard last night that their funding got approved for that, so should happen sometime soon, maybe. But
Well, thank you again so much, Zach.
hey, thank you all. Yeah, thanks.
As a reminder, our next Naturalist Nights will be February 18th in Carbondale and February 19th here at Hallam Lake, and we hope to see you guys back soon. Thanks so much.